Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. There are two things in this world Nero Wolfe hates almost as much as leaving the house. Being interrupted before 11 o'clock, and being asked to think about money he hasn't already been paid for. On the Tuesday morning that Priscilla Kent walked into the brownstone on West 35th Street, she managed to violate both principles inside of 90 seconds. Which I mention only because I've rarely seen a client survive that combination with her composure intact. She did. It was 10:40 when the doorbell rang, which meant Wolfe was still upstairs with the orchids, communing with several $1,000s worth of Cattleya hybrids in a greenhouse kept at a humidity level better suited to a Panamanian rainforest than Midtown Manhattan. I was at my desk in the office, going through the germination records Wolfe insists on calling correspondence, when I heard the bell and went to the door. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dressed in a gray suit that had been chosen by someone who understood that gray suits, done right, are a kind of armor. Dark hair pulled back tight enough to suggest she'd rehearsed calm in the mirror that morning, and not quite believed her own performance. I've opened that door for a few hundred people over the years, and you learn to read the ones who are about to lie to you versus the ones who are simply frightened. She was frightened. I filed that away and let her in. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said, in the tone of someone who had said it to 3 receptionists already that week, and been turned away by all of them. "You're seeing his associate first," I said, "Archie Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe doesn't see anyone before 11, on principle, and he doesn't see anyone at all without knowing why first, also on principle. He collects principles the way other men collect stamps. Sit down and tell me what this is about, and I'll see if it's worth interrupting a man who's currently in conversation with a flower." That got something out of her. Not quite a laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved in that direction before she remembered she was frightened, and pulled it back. She sat in the red leather chair, the one reserved for clients, and folded her hands in her lap like she was at confession. "My name is Priscilla Kent. I'm a portfolio analyst at Ashcroft Meridian. 3 days ago, my employer, Grant Ashcroft, was found dead in his office. The police have decided I'm the reason for that, and I would like to hire Mr. Wolfe to prove otherwise before they decide to make it official." I wrote that down, though I didn't need to. My memory works fine, but people trust you more when they see you writing, and trust is the only currency clients pay in before the retainer clears. Ashcroft Meridian being? An investment firm. We manage discretionary portfolios for private clients, the kind of clients who don't want their names in a newspaper, and don't want their money doing anything as vulgar as attracting attention. She said it with the flat precision of someone reciting a job description she'd grown to resent. Grant built the firm himself, 22 years ago. He was found in his office on Sunday evening by the cleaning staff. Someone had struck him with the brass bookend from his own desk. And someone had done it, according to the detective handling the case, sometime between 4 and 7 that afternoon. The only hours I can't account for, because I was alone in my own office 2 floors down, working. "Convenient, whoever picked that murder weapon," I said. "And convenient for them that you don't have an alibi." That's precisely what I've come to say. Either it's the worst luck of my professional life, or someone arranged it to be that way. She looked at me directly then, and I revised my estimate of her fear. It wasn't for herself alone. There's something else. Grant kept what he called his private book, a ledger, though it wasn't paper. It was a set of files only he had access to. We call it, unofficially, the Whispering Portfolio. It's how certain information moved among 4 or 5 of the partners, without ever touching an email server or a compliance file. I don't know precisely what's in it. I know it's gone, and I know that whoever killed Grant wanted it more than they wanted him. That's a habit of mine, a small tell I've never bothered to break, since it's useful to let a client know when they've said something worth the interruption. "You understand what you're telling me. You're telling me there was a second victim in that office Sunday night, and it happened to be a file cabinet. I'm telling you I think someone at that firm has been passing information they shouldn't have, for reasons that add up to a great deal of money. And Grant either found out or was about to. She unfolded her hands and folded them again, the other way. I make $81,000 a year, and I have $11,000 in savings. I don't know what your Mr. Wolfe charges, but I imagine it's more than that. He charges what the case is worth to him, which is a number he generally decides after he's decided he wants the case, not before. A piece of logic that has cost me more sleep than I care to admit. I stood up. Wait here. I'll see if flowers are more interesting than murder this morning. In my experience, they usually are, right up until they aren't. I found Wolfe in the plant rooms, standing over a bench of Miltonia hybrids, with the particular scowl he reserves for blooms that haven't opened on his schedule. He is not a man built for hurry, in body or temperament. 1/7 of a ton by his own accounting, poured into a chair custom-built to bear it, and disinclined to leave that chair for anything short of dinner or a subpoena. I gave him the shape of it in 4 sentences, the way he prefers. Client, victim, weapon, missing item. I left out my own opinion, since he never asks for it, before he's formed his own, and resents being preempted. He didn't look up from the Miltonias. A ledger that exists, but was never written down. That is not a missing object, Archie. That is a rumor with a body attached to it. It's a rumor that got a man's skull cracked with his own bookend, which puts it a notch above the usual office gossip. He straightened finally, with the air of a man conceding a point he'd rather not have conceded. And the young woman believes the information in this whispering portfolio, an infelicitous name, incidentally, for anything one hopes to be taken seriously, concerned trading conducted on knowledge not available to the market generally. She didn't say that outright. I'm reading between her lines, which is most of what she gave me to read. Everyone in finance trades on knowledge not available to the market generally, Archie. That is the entire enterprise, conducted under varying degrees of legality and varying degrees of shame. He moved down the bench, inspecting a dendrobium with the same scowl. The question that interests me is not whether such information existed. It is why a man who had kept it secret and unwritten for years chose this particular season to die for it. That was as close as Wolfe comes to saying yes before he's decided to say yes. And I've learned to recognize it the way you'd recognize a barometer dropping before a storm you haven't been told is coming. So, I tell her to come back at 11. Tell her to come back at 11. He clipped a browning leaf with more force than the leaf required. And Archie, find out before she arrives whether Mr. Ashcroft had children. A man builds a business for 22 years. He generally intends someone to inherit the argument, along with the assets. I went back downstairs already turning that over, because Wolfe doesn't hand out a question like that unless he's already decided the answer is going to matter more than anyone in this case currently suspects. By 11:15, Wolfe was down from the plant rooms, settled behind his desk, with the air of a man who intends to be inconvenienced, and has made his peace with it. And Priscilla Kent had gotten her first look at him. Most people's first look at Nero Wolfe involves some visible recalibration. He is not what anyone expects, being roughly the size and disposition of a Buddha who has read too much and trusts too little. But she managed hers quietly, which told me something in her favor. Wolfe took the case, as I'd expected, though the negotiation over his fee took longer than the negotiation over the murder. When it was done, he leaned back and folded his hands over the shelf of his stomach. Miss Kent, you will provide Mr. Goodwin with a list. Everyone who had access to Mr. Ashcroft's office. Everyone who had reason to want the contents of this portfolio suppressed. And everyone who benefits, in any fashion, from his death. I want names before lunch. She gave us 4. There would be more later, the way there always is. But 4 was enough to start a proper accounting. Desmond Reyes, senior partner, who had been with Ashcroft since the firm's 2nd year, and who she described, with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to editorialize, and failing anyway, as a man who believed the firm was owed to him, in some spiritual sense Grant never quite agreed to. Vera Ashcroft Lynn, Grant's niece and the firm's compliance officer. Compliance being, as Wolfe observed dryly. An interesting post for someone whose uncle apparently kept his most important records where compliance couldn't find them. Julian Marsh, a junior partner, who'd brought in a client roughly the size of the rest of the firm's book combined. A hedge fund manager named Theodore Pruitt, currently the firm's most valuable and most demanding account. And a fourth name she gave reluctantly. Her own former husband, Colin Reyes, no relation to Desmond. An unfortunate coincidence of surnames she seemed to have long since stopped explaining, who worked in the firm's operations division, and who she and Grant had both, for different reasons, distrusted. 4 people who knew about the whispering portfolio, Wolfe said. Or 4 people you suspect knew. Knew or should have known given their positions. I can't swear to what was actually in Grant's head. No one can swear to what is in anyone's head, Miss Kent. That is the entire difficulty of your profession and mine. He waved her out, with instructions to have the 4 available for interview that afternoon, and turned to me before the door had properly shut. Archie, Ashcroft's children. 1 daughter, Diane, 26, lives in Boston, hasn't worked at the firm and by all early accounts didn't want to. I'll confirm this afternoon. Confirm it soon. A man's will tells you more about his true opinion of his associates than any amount of conversation does. Desmond Reyes came in first, at 2 o'clock, wearing the kind of suit that costs more than my monthly rent, and the kind of handshake that's designed to establish who's doing whom a favor by being there. He sat in the red chair like he was auditioning it for purchase. I appreciate you seeing me, Mr. Wolfe, though I confess I don't see what a private investigator adds to a police matter. You may confess a great deal more before you leave, Mr. Reyes, though I'd rather you confessed it to a point. You were, I understand, Mr. Ashcroft's partner for some 20 years. 21. I built half of what that firm is. The half was doing a lot of work in that sentence. And he said it the way a man says a thing he said to himself so often it no longer sounds like a boast to him, only a fact. Grant had the name and the original client list. I had everything after that. Wolfe let a silence sit there long enough that Reyes felt obliged to fill it, which is a trick I've watched him play 100 times, and which works nearly every time, because very few people can outlast Wolfe at patience, having had considerably less practice. Look, Reyes said, if you're asking whether I wanted a bigger piece of the firm than Grant was willing to give me, the answer's yes. And I'll say it to the police same as I'm saying it to you, because it isn't a secret, and it isn't a motive. Wanting more money isn't the same as killing a man for it. No, Wolfe agreed. But wanting more information sometimes is. Miss Kent tells us Mr. Ashcroft kept records outside the ordinary channel. A private accounting, unwritten, of certain matters among the partners. Were you aware of it? Something moved behind Reyes's eyes. Not guilt exactly, I thought, but calculation. The look of a man deciding how much of the truth costs less than the lie would. Everyone who'd been there long enough knew Grant kept things in his head he didn't put in memos. That's not a scandal. That's how the man ran a business for 2 decades without a single regulatory complaint. And do you know what was in his head on the Sunday he died? I know. I wasn't in the building. I was at my daughter's recital in Westchester until past 8, and there are approximately 40 parents who can confirm it, along with a rather bored school administrator running the sign-in sheet. He said it flatly, an alibi laid down like a card he'd been holding since he walked in, and I noted that he hadn't waited to be asked for it. Vera Ashcroft Lynn came next, and where Reyes had filled the office with the confidence of a man used to being believed, she filled it with the careful stillness of someone used to being watched. Late 30s, dark suit, a compliance officer's habit of choosing every word like it might be entered into a record somewhere. My uncle didn't trust easily, she said, when Wolfe asked about the private files. He trusted me with the firm's public compliance, which is ironic, given that I apparently wasn't trusted with whatever he actually needed complying with. You resent that. I loved my uncle, Mr. Wolfe. I'm also permitted to notice that he kept me at arm's length from the one part of the business that mattered most, and to wonder why. She looked at her hands. If you're asking whether that's a motive, I'd remind you that murdering him hardly gives me access to information he'd already hidden from me for years. If anything, it's made the mystery permanent. Wolfe's eyes had nearly closed, which is his version of leaning forward. Unless you believed you already knew where it was kept, and needed only the opportunity. She didn't answer that one so quickly, and the pause told me more than whatever she said after it, which was a flat denial, delivered a half-second too late to be entirely convincing. Julian Marsh came in talking, and didn't stop for some time, the particular fluency of a man who's decided that charm is a form of alibi. He was younger than the other two, hungrier in a way that showed at the edges, even through the polish. And he made sure Wolfe knew within the first 2 minutes that Theodore Pruitt's account was worth more to the firm than Reyes and Ashcroft Lynn's combined books. Which means, Wolfe said, that you had considerably more to lose than to gain from any instability at the firm. Exactly. I didn't want Grant dead. I wanted Grant healthy and grateful and inclined to make me a full partner before Pruitt got restless and started taking calls from our competitors, which he does about twice a year, for sport. He smiled, and it was a good smile, well practiced. Grant dying is the worst possible outcome for me. Everything's frozen. Pruitt's already asked me twice this week whether the firm's stable, and I've had to lie both times. You lie easily then. The smile didn't move, but something under it did. I lie the way anyone in my business lies, Mr. Wolfe. Professionally, and only about the things that don't matter. Wolfe made a small sound that might have been agreement and might have been something else entirely, and let him go without another word, which unsettled Marsh more, I think, than any accusation would have. 3 suspects down, 1 to go, and by the time Colin Reyes came through the door at 4 o'clock, Priscilla Kent's ex-husband, quieter than the other 3, with the particular wariness of a man who knows he's the one everyone already suspects before he opens his mouth. I had the beginnings of a shape in my head, though not yet the shape of an answer. Wolfe, watching Colin settle into the red chair like a man sitting down for a dental procedure, wore the expression he gets when the shape is starting to form for him too, and hasn't yet decided whether he likes what it's becoming. Colin Reyes had the look of a man who'd rehearsed his innocence so many times it had started to sound like a lie, even to him. Mid-30s. Sandy hair going prematurely gray at the temples, in the way stress does that to some men, faster than age ever could. Hands that didn't know where to rest. Desk, lap, desk again. I already told the police everything, he said, before Wolfe had asked him a single question. I don't see the point of telling it twice. The point, Mr. Reyes, is that I was not present for the first telling, and I find accounts improve or deteriorate on repetition in ways that interest me. Wolfe folded his hands. You work in operations at Ashcroft Meridian. What does that mean precisely? Trade settlement, reconciliation, making sure the numbers that go out match the numbers that came in. It's not glamorous, it's the plumbing. He said it with the particular bitterness of a man who'd once wanted to be something other than plumbing. I process what the partners decide. I don't decide anything myself. And yet you knew Priscilla Kent well enough to marry her, and Grant Ashcroft well enough, I gather, to be distrusted by him. That landed somewhere tender. Colin's jaw tightened before he answered. Grant didn't trust anyone who'd been divorced from someone he liked better than he liked them. That's not evidence of anything except Grant playing favorites, which he did, constantly. Where were you Sunday, between 4 and 7? Home, alone, which I understand is the least convincing answer available, and also happens to be true. He looked at me then, as if I might be more sympathetic than the 1/7 of a ton behind the desk, and found nothing there either. Look, I didn't like Grant. I'll say that plainly, since everyone else in that building will say it for me eventually. But not liking a man isn't the same as splitting his head open with his own bookend. Wolfe let him go a few minutes later, unsatisfied on both sides, which is often how Wolfe prefers to end a first interview, leaving a man convinced he's said too little rather than too much. So he spends the interval before the next conversation deciding what to add rather than what to retract. The detective on the case, a heavy-set veteran named Pearlie Stebbins, who had crossed paths with Wolfe often enough to have developed a professional weariness specifically calibrated to this brownstone, came by that evening with the details Wolfe had been waiting for, delivered with the air of a man doing a favor he fully expected to regret. Time of deaths between 4 and 7 Sunday. Medical examiners about as certain as they get. Weapons the brass bookend, like the girl told you. Matches the wound, matches the smear pattern, his prints on it, along with somebody else's that didn't come back clean enough to match anybody in the system. Stebbins consulted his own notes, though I suspected he had them memorized and just liked making Wolfe wait. No sign of forced entry. Whoever did it, Ashcroft let them in himself, which in a building with card access after hours means it was somebody already inside, or somebody he buzzed up personally. The building's access logs, Wolfe said, show 4 people badged into the floor that afternoon. Reyes, the partner, not the ex-husband, out at 3:30 for his kid's recital, logged out and confirmed by the elevator camera, so he's clean unless he's got a twin. Ashcroft Lynn badged in at 5, says she came back for a file she forgot, left at 5:20. Marsh badged in at 6. Says he was picking up materials for a Monday meeting with Pruitt. And Colin Reyes never badged in at all that day, according to the log, which either means he wasn't there, or means somebody let him up without him using his own card, which in that building happens more often than the building would like to admit, since half the staff still holds the door for each other out of politeness. And the missing item? The files Miss Kent describes as informal record-keeping. That's the part I don't love telling you, because it makes the case messier, not cleaner. Ashcroft's desk drawer, the locked one, was open and empty when the cleaning staff found him. No sign what was in it. Could have been cash, could have been jewelry, could have been your whispering ledger, could have been nothing at all. Man might have just cleaned it out himself weeks ago, and nobody noticed. Stebbins closed his notebook with the particular finality of a man who'd said more than his lieutenant would like. District attorney likes the ex-husband. No alibi, known grudge, and there's a witness. A security guard downstairs puts a man matching his general description in the lobby around 5:40, though the guard admits he didn't get a clear look at the face. General description, Wolfe repeated, with the faint distaste he reserves for evidence too vague to be useful and too specific to be entirely dismissed. How general? Dark coat, medium build, dark hair, which Mr. Wolfe describes about a third of the adult male population of this city, present company included. Stebbins allowed himself something close to a smile. I know it's thin. It's what we've got. And thin evidence against a man with no alibi still beats no evidence against anybody. After he left, Wolfe sat with his eyes closed for a while, the way he does when he's turning something over that hasn't yet resolved into a shape he trusts. Archie. The elevator camera confirms Desmond Reyes left at 3:30. Confirm independently whether the recital he claims to have attended actually began before he could plausibly have arrived, given traffic and distance to Westchester. You think he's lying about the recital. I think a man who volunteers an alibi before he's asked for one has usually rehearsed it, and rehearsed alibis reward scrutiny far more often than spontaneous ones. He opened his eyes, and find out precisely what Julian Marsh needed from that office at 6 o'clock on a Sunday evening, when Monday meetings are customarily prepared for on Friday, by men who value their weekends as much as Mr. Marsh plainly values his own comfort. I made a note of both, and something else besides, a small itch at the back of my mind about a security guard's description that fit a third of Manhattan, and a compliance officer who'd taken half a second too long to deny knowing where her uncle hid his secrets. Wolfe does not conduct interrogations so much as he conducts autopsies on the living, and the difference, as he'd be the first to tell you, is that the living can still contradict themselves in real time, which is where the real information lives. He had all 4 of them back the following morning, an unusual request, since Wolfe generally prefers his subjects one at a time, sequentially disassembled. But he wanted, he said, to watch what happened when they were disassembled in front of each other. They arrived within minutes of one another, and sat in a loose semicircle of chairs Fritz had brought in, looking like 4 people who'd been told to share a waiting room with their own worst suspicions. Desmond Reyes took the seat nearest the door, as if proximity to an exit mattered. Vera Ashcroft Lynn sat with her hands folded, exactly as she had the day before. Julian Marsh made a show of being relaxed that convinced no one, least of all Wolfe. Colin Reyes sat slightly apart from the other 3, the way a man sits when he already knows he's been cast as the villain of the room. "I ask you here together," Wolfe said, "because 4 separate accounts of the same afternoon have produced so far 4 separate afternoons, and I find that more instructive than any of you taking it individually. Reyes, the elder, you left the building at 3:30, according to the elevator log, bound for your daughter's recital in Westchester." "That's correct. The recital began at what hour?" 5 o'clock. "And the drive from this office to the school in question takes how long in ordinary Sunday traffic?" Reyes's jaw did something small. "Depends on the bridge. Estimate it for me." 40 minutes, maybe 50. "Then you arrived with well over an hour to spare, which is a curious amount of slack for a man who left in apparent haste." Wolfe's eyes had gone to half-mast, which meant he already knew the answer, and was only confirming the shape of the lie. "Where were you, Mr. Reyes, in the interval?" The room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet, when everyone in them suddenly wants to hear an answer they're pretending not to be curious about. Reyes looked, for the first time since I'd met him, like a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do out loud. "I stopped for coffee," he said, "near the school. I sat in the car for a while. I don't see what business it is of anyone's, how a man spends an hour, before his daughter recites 4 minutes of Chopin she's been butchering in the living room for a month. None whatever, ordinarily, except that you volunteered your alibi before Mr. Goodwin asked for it, which suggested rehearsal, and rehearsal generally implies a script written to cover something more than an hour of coffee." Wolfe turned, unhurried, before Reyes could recover his composure. "Miss Ashcroft Lynn, you returned to the office at 5 o'clock for a file you had forgotten. What file?" "A client suitability review. Routine." "Which client?" She hesitated. Not long, but long enough that Julian Marsh's eyes flicked toward her. A small involuntary thing, gone as quickly as it appeared. But I caught it, and I saw Wolfe catch it too. "Pruitt's account," she said finally. "There'd been a query about risk tolerance documentation. On a Sunday. Compliance doesn't observe weekends, Mr. Wolfe, whatever the rest of the firm does." "And did you find this file?" Yes, eventually." "Where was it kept?" "In my own office, where such files are always kept." "Then your errand required no visit to Mr. Ashcroft's office at all, and yet the building log places you on his floor, not your own, for 20 minutes. Wolfe let that sit, and this time the silence in the room had teeth in it. "Which floor is yours, Miss Ashcroft Lynn?" "And Mr. Ashcroft's office?" 5. Her hands, which had been perfectly still through the entire exchange, moved now, just a fraction, refolding themselves in her lap. A tell so small I'd have missed it if I hadn't spent 30 years learning to watch hands instead of faces. "I stopped to see if he was in. I wanted to ask him something. It isn't a crime to want a word with your own uncle." "No, but it is curious that you didn't mention it yesterday, when the question of your movements that afternoon was asked directly and answered incompletely." Wolfe moved on before she could construct a second answer, which is a technique I've watched him deploy for years. Never let a witness finish patching one hole before you're pointing at the next. "Mr. Marsh, you arrived at 6 for materials pertaining to a Monday meeting. What materials specifically?" "Performance summaries. Pruitt likes to see his numbers before he sees anyone's face." "Prepared by whom?" "By me, mostly. Some pulled from the firm's shared drive. Then they were available to you from any terminal in the building, or from your own home, given that Ashcroft Meridian systems permit remote access. A fact Miss Kent confirmed to Mr. Goodwin only this morning. Wolfe let his eyes rest on Marsh, with the mild, terrible patience of a man who has already won an argument, and is simply waiting for the other party to notice. Why did you need to be physically present, on a Sunday evening, in a building where a man would be found dead within the hour? Marsh's easy manner, which had survived the previous day's interview more or less intact, finally showed a crack. I like hard copies. Call it superstition. Call it what you like. I call it an explanation that arrived a half-second after it needed to, which is generally the sound a fabrication makes when it's built under pressure, rather than in advance. Wolfe shifted his bulk, the closest he comes to a gesture of impatience. 3 of you have now offered alibis that dissolve on inspection into unaccounted intervals of between 20 minutes and an hour. Each of you in or near the building at the hour in question. Each of you now caught, having initially concealed some part of your presence there. That is not proof any one of you is a murderer. It is proof that all 3 of you are liars, which is a different crime, and a more common one. Colin Reyes, who had sat through the entire exchange in near silence, allowed himself something that was almost a smile. Feels good not being the only one, for once. Don't celebrate prematurely, Mr. Reyes, Wolfe said, without looking at him. You are the only one of the 4 who cannot account for any part of that afternoon at all, which makes your silence considerably more expensive than their lies. He closed his eyes fully, then, in the manner that meant the interview, for him, was over, whatever anyone else in the room still had to say. Archie, show them out. I find I require lunch and further conversation before I've had it. Wolfe's insistence on lunch before further conversation gave me the afternoon to do what he actually wanted done, which was to go out into the city and shake a few things loose that don't shake loose in an office on West 35th Street, however good the Shad Row. I started with the coffee shop Desmond Reyes claimed to have haunted for the better part of an hour, a place 2 blocks from his daughter's school, with the particular tired cheerfulness of an establishment that survives on parents killing time before recitals. The girl behind the counter remembered him. A man in a good coat tips well and complains about the espresso, which apparently makes an impression. But she remembered him arriving closer to 4:30 than 4, and leaving within 20 minutes, not the better part of an hour. That left Reyes with a hole in his afternoon of some 40 minutes, unaccounted for, between a coffee shop 2 blocks from the recital and the recital itself. 40 minutes is enough time to do a great many things in Manhattan, though driving back into the city and out again isn't reasonably one of them, which told me his hole in time was local to Westchester, not to the murder scene. I filed it as suspicious and irrelevant, a combination that comes up more often in this business than people expect. Ashcroft Meridian's building super was a more useful conversation. A wiry man named Delgado, who'd worked the lobby desk for 11 years, and had opinions about everyone who'd passed through it. Most of them uncharitable, and all of them, I suspected, accurate. I asked him about the security guard's sighting of a man in a dark coat around 5:40. Kid on the desk that night, name's Tomas. He's new. He's not wrong exactly, he's just not useful. Half the men who work in that building own a dark coat. I could show you 6 coats in the closet upstairs that'd fit that description. Delgado shook his head. You want to know who was actually in that lobby Sunday? You don't ask Tomas what he saw. You ask what he heard, because that kid's got a memory for voices like nothing I've seen. That was worth the price of admission, and I sat with Tomas for 20 minutes over a coffee I bought him, which loosens memory a good deal faster than a badge does. He hadn't gotten a clear look at the face of the man in the dark coat, no, but he remembered, unprompted, that the man had said something to him in passing, a complaint about the elevator being slow, delivered in a voice Tomas described, after some thought, as kind of clipped, like he was annoyed about more than the elevator. Clipped wasn't Colin Reyes, who I'd now spoken to twice, and who spoke, if anything, with the drawn-out carefulness of a man choosing every word for fear of it being used against him. Clipped in my notebook went down next to Julian Marsh, whose charm ran fast and light right up until something interrupted it, and then went sharp. I saved the best conversation for last, which was with a woman named Renata Ochoa, an analyst at Ashcroft Meridian, who had been out sick the week of the murder, and who Priscilla Kent mentioned almost as an afterthought. Someone who'd worked closely with Julian Marsh on the Pruitt account, and who, Kent said, used to be friendlier with Julian than she is now, though I couldn't tell you why that changed. I found her at her apartment on the Upper West Side, recovering from a flu that had clearly been real, and clearly hadn't stopped her from noticing things. Julian's good at his job, she told me, over tea she insisted on making, despite looking like she should be in bed. He's also good at making sure the credit for other people's work ends up looking like his own, in the paperwork, if not in the room. I noticed it about 8 months ago, on a set of Pruitt account notes I'd drafted, that came back from Grant's office, with Julian's name on the summary page, and mine nowhere in sight. You told Ashcroft? I told Grant, yes, in April. He said he'd look into it. She wrapped both hands around her mug. He never got back to me about it, which I chalked up to Grant being Grant. The man forgot things that didn't involve his orchid schedule or his dinner menu. But now I wonder if he did look into it, and found something bigger than a stolen credit line, and just hadn't told me yet. That was the thread I brought back to the brownstone at 6 o'clock, along with the 40 minutes Desmond Reyes couldn't account for, and a clipped voice complaining about a slow elevator. And Wolfe listened to all of it, with his eyes shut and his fingers laced over his stomach, saying nothing until I'd finished. Renata Ochoa reported a grievance to Ashcroft in April concerning Marsh appropriating credit for her work on the Pruitt account. And Ashcroft, by her account, said he would look into it and never circled back. That's the size of it. A man who kept an unwritten ledger of sensitive information among his partners does not fail to circle back to a complaint touching his firm's largest account, Archie, unless circling back meant something considerably more consequential than a stern word to Mr. Marsh about attribution. Wolfe opened his eyes. It meant, I think, that Ashcroft used April's grievance as an occasion to look more closely at Marsh's handling of the Pruitt relationship generally, and found something there worth recording privately rather than reporting through the ordinary channels of the firm, which is precisely the sort of finding a whispering portfolio exists to hold. Get Miss Kent on the telephone. I want to know whether Ashcroft's private files were organized by date, and if so, whether an April entry can be dated with any precision. I made the call, and Kent, when I reached her, said something that made Wolfe sit up as much as Wolfe ever sits up. That Grant Ashcroft had in fact changed his personal calendar habits sometime in the spring, adding a recurring Tuesday evening block marked only "Personal, Do Not Schedule," a block that had appeared as best she could recall sometime in April and had continued, without explanation, every week since. Every Tuesday evening, Wolfe repeated, for 3 months, a man who never left this office building before 7 if he could help it, made time for something he didn't want his own staff to know about. He was quiet for a moment, turning it. Archie, tomorrow find out where Julian Marsh spends his Tuesday evenings. I begin to suspect Mr. Ashcroft wasn't hiding a habit of his own. I suspect he was following someone else's. I spent the better part of Wednesday finding out where Julian Marsh spent his Tuesday evenings, and the answer, when I finally ran it down through a doorman at a building on East 62nd Street, who required more persuading than his salary should have made necessary, was a woman named Celeste Fernier, who turned out to be, according to public filings I pulled that afternoon, the sole officer of a small investment advisory registered in Delaware called Fernier Capital Partners, an entity with exactly one client, and that client, as best I could determine from a scrap of paper Marsh had apparently been careless enough to leave photographed in a filing cabinet Renata Ochoa still had access to, was Theodore Pruitt. I brought all of it back to Wolfe by 6 o'clock, and laid it out the way he likes it laid out, Facts first, speculation held back until asked for. So Marsh has been running a side arrangement with Ashcroft Meridian's biggest client, I said, through a woman who isn't his wife, in an entity that isn't Ashcroft Meridian. And Ashcroft found out about it sometime in April and started following him on Tuesdays to confirm it. Wolfe sat with his eyes closed for a long moment, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression I'd learned to recognize over the years. Not triumph, not yet, but the particular satisfaction of a man watching a shape resolve out of noise. Consider what such an arrangement would mean, practically, Archie. Mr. Pruitt is Ashcroft Meridian's largest account. If Marsh had arranged, through Miss Furnier's entity, to direct some portion of Pruitt's trading activity, or Pruitt's information regarding his own trading intentions, outside the firm's official channel, two things follow. First, Ashcroft Meridian would be earning considerably less than it should on its largest relationship, since fees generated through Furnier Capital would never touch the firm's books. Second, and more gravely, if that arrangement involved Pruitt trading ahead of his own firm's activity, or Marsh feeding Pruitt information about other clients' positions to advantage his trades, the exposure would not be merely financial. It would be criminal, for Marsh, for Pruitt, and conceivably for the firm itself. Were regulators to conclude Ashcroft Meridian had failed to supervise its own partner. Which is exactly the kind of thing a man would want written down somewhere private before he confronted anybody with it. Insurance. Precisely. A ledger, unwritten in any official sense, existing only where Ashcroft alone controlled it, recording an arrangement he'd discovered but not yet acted upon. Because acting on it prematurely without proof would have cost him his firm's reputation as surely as the arrangement itself, if it became known. He needed to be certain before he moved. And certainty, in matters like this, is assembled slowly. Wolfe's fingers drummed once against the arm of his chair, a gesture so rare I nearly missed its significance. Which raises the question of timing, Archie. If Ashcroft had been watching Marsh since April, 3 months of Tuesdays, why did the matter come to a head now, on a particular Sunday in July, rather than at any point in the preceding weeks? Something forced his hand, or forced someone's hand. Yes, get Miss Kent back on the telephone. I want to know whether Theodore Pruitt had any scheduled meeting with Ashcroft in the days immediately preceding his death. A meeting Ashcroft himself might have called, rather than one that appeared on the ordinary firm calendar. I made the call, and this time Kent didn't need to check anything. She remembered it herself, with the particular clarity of a fact she hadn't thought significant until asked directly. Ashcroft had requested, the previous Thursday, a private meeting with Pruitt for the following Monday morning, the day after he died. A meeting Kent had been asked to schedule, but not told the purpose of. Unusual enough that she'd remarked on it to a colleague at the time. A meeting scheduled for the day after his death, Wolfe said when I relayed it, which he did not live to attend, and which, I should think, someone with a great deal to lose from that meeting occurring would have had considerable motive to prevent. Marsh. Marsh if Marsh knew the meeting existed, or Pruitt himself, if Ashcroft had been careless enough to signal his suspicions directly to the man he suspected, rather than confronting Marsh first. Wolfe closed his eyes again. There is a third possibility, Archie, which I find myself unable to dismiss as readily as I'd like. Miss Ashcroft Lynn is the firm's compliance officer. If her uncle had in fact uncovered an arrangement of the kind we now suspect, the ordinary and expected channel for that discovery, the channel Ashcroft deliberately avoided, would have been his own compliance department. Which means Ashcroft either didn't trust his niece with the discovery, or didn't trust her not to protect the very partner she now claims baffled her by never mentioning. You think she knew. I think her hesitation, twice now, on the subject of what she was doing on her uncle's floor that Sunday, is not the hesitation of a woman innocently forgetful of a file. It is the hesitation of a woman deciding how much truth she can afford, and I intend to find out tomorrow precisely what that figure is. He opened his eyes fully, and there was something in them now that I'd come to recognize as the moment before the trap closes. Not certainty yet, but the shape of certainty, close enough to touch. Tomorrow, Archie, I want Mr. Marsh back in this office, and I want him to believe, when he arrives, that we already know considerably more than we do. A man convinced he's already caught behaves very differently from a man merely being questioned. And it is time Mr. Marsh behaved differently. Wolfe's instructions for the following morning were precise, which they generally are when he's decided a case has reached the stage where theater does more work than interrogation. I was to telephone Julian Marsh and tell him, in a tone suggesting regret rather than triumph, that Mr. Wolfe had uncovered certain financial records connecting him to an entity called Fernier Capital Partners, and that Wolfe wished to give him the opportunity to explain himself before the information went to the district attorney's office, rather than after. It wasn't strictly true. We had the filing and the doorman's testimony, and Renata Ochoa's photograph, which was suggestive, but a long way from the kind of proof that survives a courtroom. But Wolfe has never let the difference between suggestive and conclusive slow him down when a lie will produce the same effect faster than the truth would. Marsh arrived at 11, and the charm that had gotten him through 2 previous interviews mostly intact was, this time visibly an effort, rather than a habit. He sat in the red chair like a man expecting it to be electrified. "I want to be clear," he said, before Wolfe had asked him anything, "that whatever arrangement you think you found, it has nothing to do with Grant's death. I had no reason to want him dead. I had every reason to want him alive and uninformed." Wolfe let that sit a moment, savoring, I thought, the particular quality of a confession that arrives disguised as a defense. "Then you confirm the arrangement exists?" Marsh's jaw worked once before he answered, the look of a man recalculating a bet he'd already half lost. "Celeste, Miss Fernier, runs an advisory. Pruitt is her client. I introduced them 2 years ago because Pruitt wanted certain trades executed with more discretion than Ashcroft Meridian's compliance department would tolerate. And Celeste's shop doesn't ask the questions Vera asks." He said Vera's name with a flicker of something that might have been resentment or might have been fear, I couldn't tell which, and filed it for later. That's all it ever was on my end. A fee for an introduction, paid quarterly, entirely legal, if inconvenient to explain to a compliance officer who'd call it a conflict of interest, even though nothing about it violated a single regulation. And yet, you never disclosed it to Mr. Ashcroft. Because Grant would have seen exactly what you're seeing now, the appearance of it, not the substance. And the appearance would have cost me the Pruitt relationship, regardless of what the substance actually was. Marsh's hands, which had been still, moved now, restless in his lap. "I found out 3 weeks ago that Grant knew. Renata let something slip. She'd complained to him back in April about credit on the account, and in the course of that conversation, he'd apparently gone digging into everything I touched on Pruitt's business, and found Fernier. I didn't know how much he knew, or what he intended to do about it, and I spent 3 weeks trying to find out, before he could act. Which brings us to the Monday meeting he had scheduled with Mr. Pruitt. Were you aware of it? The silence that followed was longer than any that had come before it, and I watched something settle over Marsh's face, not quite defeat, but the particular stillness of a man who's decided the lie has stopped being useful. "Yes, I found out about it Friday, from Pruitt himself, who mentioned it in passing without understanding why I went pale hearing it. I still assumed that Grant meant to tell Pruitt about Fernier directly, which would have ended both the referral arrangement and very likely my career at that firm inside a week." "So you had a motive to prevent that meeting from occurring?" "I had a motive to talk to Grant before it occurred, which is precisely what I intended to do, and precisely why I was in that building at 6 o'clock on Sunday, not for performance summaries, which was a lie, and I'll own that it was a lie, since you've plainly already worked out that it was. I went to his office to ask him not to destroy me, over a referral fee that never hurt a single client. He wasn't there." Marsh looked up, and there was something almost pleading in it now, the look of a man who understood he'd used up his charm, and had nothing left but the truth to trade on. "I want to be believed on this specific point, Mr. Wolfe, because it is the only point that matters to whether I hang for something I didn't do. His office was empty when I arrived, a little after 6. The desk drawer was already open. I assumed he'd stepped out, and I left within a few minutes because I lost my nerve, and because I didn't want to be seen loitering outside a partner's office with an accusation I hadn't yet made. Wolfe's eyes had opened fully now, which they rarely do mid-interview, and I understood we'd arrived at the piece he'd been building toward. The drawer was already open and already empty at a little after 6. Empty, or nearly. I didn't go through it. I want to be clear about that too, since I understand how it looks. But the drawer was pulled out, and I didn't see any files in it, and I remember thinking it was odd, because Grant kept that drawer locked religiously, and I'd never once seen it open in 4 years. Which means, Wolfe said slowly, that whatever was taken from that drawer was taken before 6 o'clock, not after, and that Mr. Ashcroft, if the medical examiner's window is to be trusted, was very possibly already dead by the time you arrived, since a man does not leave his own most private drawer standing open while he steps out for coffee. He was silent a moment, and I could see him running the afternoon's movements against each other like a man laying transparencies over a single map. Miss Ashcroft Lynn was in that office between 5 and 5:20, by her own admission, though she claims to have come and gone without incident. You arrived a little after 6 and found the drawer already emptied. That leaves a window of some 40 minutes, Archie, between the compliance officer's departure and Mr. Marsh's arrival, during which a locked drawer was opened, emptied, and its contents removed from a building whose access logs show no one else badging onto that floor. Unless somebody didn't need to badge in because they were already there, I said, or came up with someone who did. Or, Wolfe said, and his voice had gone very quiet, the way it does when the last piece finds its socket. Unless the person who emptied that drawer had never left the floor at all. And the 20 minutes Miss Ashcroft Lynn admits to are not the whole of the time she spent there, but merely the portion she has been willing, so far, to confess to. He looked at me, and there was nothing left of idle theorizing in it. Archie, get Miss Kent, Mr. Reyes, Miss Ashcroft Lynn, Mr. Marsh, and Mr. Reyes the Younger back into this office tomorrow evening, all of them, together, and send word to Mr. Stebbins that he may wish to attend as well. I find I am ready to stop asking questions and to start answering the one that matters. Wolfe likes his audiences seated before he begins, and by 7 the following evening, the office looked like a small, uncomfortable dinner party missing its dinner. Priscilla Kent sat nearest my desk, still in her gray armor. Desmond Reyes, Vera Ashcroft Lynn, Julian Marsh, and Colin Reyes were arranged in the row of yellow chairs Fritz had carried in. And Pearlie Stebbins stood near the door with the patient, immovable posture of a man who has learned not to sit down until Wolfe tells him whether he'll need his handcuffs. Wolfe waited until Fritz had poured the coffee and left, because he considers an audience's comfort a prerequisite to their honesty, and then folded his hands over his stomach and began. Grant Ashcroft was killed sometime between 4 and 5:30 in the afternoon, not, as the police window originally suggested, as late as 7, a discrepancy I will explain shortly. He was struck once with force by his own brass bookend, by someone he had led into that private argument willingly, since there was no forced entry and no struggle beyond the single blow. This was not a planned murder. It was a weapon of opportunity, seized in the heat of a confrontation that had not been expected to end that way by the person who ended it. Vera Ashcroft Lynn's hands, folded in her lap as they had been in every interview, did not move. That in itself told me something. A woman who could hold that still through an opening like that had been holding still for 3 days already. Mr. Reyes, Wolfe nodded toward Desmond, lied to us about an hour he spent near his daughter's school. An hour I have since confirmed had nothing to do with this case, and everything to do with a private matter he is entitled to keep private, now that I know it does not touch Mr. Ashcroft's death. I mention it only to close the door on it, so that it does not continue to shadow a conversation it has no bearing on. Reyes's shoulders came down half an inch. The relief of a man realizing his secret, whatever it was, would leave this room unspoken. Mr. Marsh has confessed to an arrangement with a client of Ashcroft Meridian's, conducted through an entity called Fernier Capital Partners, which Mr. Ashcroft discovered in April, and had begun quietly investigating. A discovery that prompted a private record of his findings, kept in the informal ledger Miss Kent has described to us as the Whispering Portfolio, and a meeting scheduled with Mr. Pruitt for the Monday after his death, a meeting Mr. Ashcroft did not live to attend. Wolfe's eyes moved, unhurried, to Marsh. You arrived at the office a little after 6 that evening, and found the desk drawer already open and already empty. And you did not see Mr. Ashcroft, because you did not fully enter the office. You looked in from the doorway, lost your nerve, and left, and the body, I would guess, was not visible from that vantage. Is that a fair account? Marsh pale nodded once. That means the drawer was emptied before 6 o'clock. Miss Ashcroft Lynn, and here Wolfe's gaze settled, and stayed. You badged onto that floor at 5 o'clock, and told Mr. Manning, watching blank 1A, Goodwin, and told me that you left at 5:20, having retrieved a compliance file that was, by your own admission, kept in your own office on the floor below, and which therefore required no visit to your uncle's office at all. I told you, I stopped to see if he was in. You did. And when I asked why you hadn't mentioned that visit in your first account of the afternoon, you offered an explanation that arrived a half-second late, which is the sound an explanation makes when it is built rather than remembered. Wolfe's voice hadn't risen, hadn't sharpened, it had simply continued, the way water continues downhill regardless of what's in its way. I put it to you that you did not leave that office at 5:20. I put it to you that you remained considerably longer, and that during that time you and your uncle argued about the very ledger this room has spent a week discussing, and about your place, or your absence of a place, within it. That's speculation, Mr. Wolfe. You have no. I have this, Wolfe said, and it was the first time his voice had actually hardened all evening. Mr. Marsh's eyes went to you, involuntarily, when you were asked which client's file you'd retrieved, and yours went to his in turn, twice, in 2 separate interviews, each time a question touched the Pruitt account or the arrangement surrounding it. 2 people who claim no particular connection do not exchange that glance unless something already sits between them that the rest of us haven't been told about. I put it to you plainly. You knew about Fernier Capital before your uncle died. As compliance officer, some portion of Mr. Marsh's paperwork on the Pruitt account crossed your desk, and you let it pass without flagging it. Whether from personal regard for Mr. Marsh or simple negligence is a distinction for another proceeding, not this one. But your uncle's private investigation, had it gone forward, would not have exposed Mr. Marsh alone. It would have exposed your own failure to catch what your position existed to catch. That is the motive your uncle's death served, Miss Ashcroft Lynn, not inheritance, which by his will goes chiefly to a daughter who never wished to touch the firm. And not any grievance about influence, though I imagine that grievance was real and old, and made the argument easier to have. It was self-preservation, arrived at suddenly, with a bookend in reach. The room had gone very still. The particular stillness that precedes a confession the way the drop in a barometer precedes weather. Vera Ashcroft Lynn's hands finally moved, not to cover her face, not to reach for anything, but simply to unfold, slowly, as though she'd been holding a shape together by main force, and had at last run out of strength for it. He said he'd been protecting me, she said, very quietly, by keeping me out of it. He said if I'd known and hadn't acted, it would have been worse for me than never knowing at all. And I told him that wasn't protection, that was contempt dressed up as kindness. And he said, she stopped, started again. He said I'd already had my chance to catch it, and hadn't. And now it was too late for either of us to pretend I hadn't known. I picked up the bookend because it was in my hand already, I'd been holding it while we argued, turning it over the way you do with something on a desk. And then, I wasn't holding it anymore, and he was on the floor, and I took the files because I couldn't leave them there to prove what he'd just said about me was true. Stebbins moved then, unhurried, the way he always moves when a room has already done his work for him. And the rest of what followed, the formalities, the reading of rights, Vera Ashcroft Lynn's quiet departure between two officers who'd been waiting in a car outside the whole evening on Wolfe's private instruction. I'll leave out, since Wolfe has never had much patience for the parts of an evening that happen after the logic's been settled. He had beer that night, 2 bottles, and told me the Miltonius had finally opened, as though the two facts belonged in the same sentence, which for Wolfe, they generally do. I sat at my desk finishing the last of my notes, and thought about Priscilla Kent, cleared now of a shadow she'd never much deserved, and about a woman who'd killed her own uncle over an inheritance that was never money at all, but the simple, brutal fact of being trusted, and about how in this business, more often than the murder itself, it's the ledger nobody wanted written down that finally gets somebody killed. Well, I said, another satisfied client, another orchid in bloom, and a woman on her way to Rikers over a compliance file she should have flagged 8 months ago. Wolfe didn't look up from his beer. Some ledgers, Archie, are worth keeping precisely because they whisper. It's the ones people go to such trouble to keep silent that generally have the loudest things to say. I couldn't argue with that, so I didn't try. I just poured myself something a little stronger than beer and let the house go quiet around us, the way it does at the end of every case, right before the next client rings that bell and ruins Wolfe's morning all over again.